In an earlier video, and I'll put a link in the description, I demonstrated how to disassemble the Ford Courier's 35 amp hour Mitsubishi alternator. Now it's time to put it back together. Rather than order the bearings from a parts store, I ended up just ordering a bunch from Amazon because it was a lot cheaper. There's two sizes that you'll need displayed on the screen here if you decide to do the same. The letters on the end of the bearing, they just denote what type of seal it uses. I opted for the metal seal versions because that's what matched what was on there from the factory. To install the bearing on the rotor, I used an impact socket with the same outer diameter as the inside diameter of the bearing. That way, when I'm hitting on the inside bearing lip, I'm not going to damage it. I'm just pointing out here that even though I drove the bearing flush, there's still a tiny gap before it's fully seated. I needed to swap to a slightly different size socket to drive it home all the way. I did a quick test fit to make sure the bearing is in the right place. Then I decided to throw the hardware in a Ziploc with some rust remover before continuing. I probably should have done that the night before, but they weren't very badly corroded anyway. I was just doing it just in case. There's a little isolator to slip over the one stud that's attached to the windings. Then you can insert the windings into the housing, making sure that you line up the stud with the one larger hole. Isolators go on both sides of that bolt as it goes through the housing, so I presume it's so that it doesn't contact the alternator housing and then ground out on the body. Then I grabbed the bag of fasteners, shook it a little to dislodge anything that the rust remover had knocked loose, and then I dumped the liquid back in the bottle and then dried off the fasteners on a towel. Along with the one nut for the stud on the back, there are 3 medium-length screws holding the windings to the alternator body. Those are JIS screws, by the way, not Phillips. I'm just pointing out again the isolator that keeps the bolt centered in the hole and the 3 screws you must reinsert on the inside. When it's time to reinsert the rotor into the alternator body, the brushes are slightly in the way. They're spring-loaded, so if you kind of insert the rotor a little bit off center, you can push them in and then allow the rotor to slide all the way home. And once it's seated properly, it should spin freely. Then it's time to put the bearing in the outer alternator cap, and you could use a socket and whack it with a hammer like I did for the other one. But this time, I decided to treat it like a gentleman and use my arbor press instead. Now we're approaching the final assembly stages. Before sliding the cover over the arbor shaft, don't forget the triangular washer. I'm guessing it's just there to hold the bearing in place against the outer cage. Then there are 3 short screws to install. It's time for the 3 long screws after that that join the 2 shells together. Note that when you do this, you have to line up at least one of the ears with the top and the bottom cover. That's where the big long bolt will go when you reinstall the alternator. After pushing the 3 screws in, I still had a little bit of a gap, so I just walked the 2 halves together by going around in a circle, slowly tightening the screws. If you just do it a little bit at a time, it keeps everything lined up. I thought that it was time for the fan now, and then I remembered that there's actually another spacer that goes on first. So it's spacer, fan, and then the 2 halves of the pulley. I was checking them out, trying to figure out if they were identical or not, but there's some markings on them that match, and I could see that there wasn't really anything to distinguish them. Then all that's left is the lock washer and the nut. And the rotor spins inside the alternator, so you probably want an impact wrench when you put the nut back on. Or if you were trying to do it without that, you could probably, I don't know, maybe insert a couple screwdrivers through the alternator body to hold the rotor in place while you tighten it. That's probably going to be a little awkward, but I bet it would work. And that's it.
This project is serious because new truck it is. I'm Courier, curious, my wife is furious. I have a family of 3, but it barely suits me. Spending much money, she says it's not funny. Everything's new, watch out, it could happen to you. Courier, I'm curious and remain oblivious to all the laughter you'll hear hereafter.
Quick surprise postscript. If you come across one of these on the back of your alternator, all it is a noise suppressor for the electricity that the alternator generates. You don't necessarily need it, but if you don't have it, it may cause some noise in your radio and possibly some other electronic interference. Mine was busted, so I did end up soldering it, but I don't actually know if that's good enough or not. I may end up having to hunt one down after the fact.